Well, it gives me great pleasure to be here at the Instituto de Nutrición, de Ciencias Médicas y Nutrición Salvador Zubirán. Es un instituto que yo conocía desde mucho tiempo. Es un gran honor de estar aquí por su 75 aniversario de la formación del instituto. Yo voy a share my screen. Mi nombre es Roger Glass. Yo soy director del Fogharty International Center and the Associate Director for Global Health at NIH. And I was interested to note that Dr. Zubirán had a long-time relationship with NIH's Office of International Affairs, which became the Fogharty International Center that I direct. He was really a visionary, and it's that vision that we're celebrating today with this anniversary. But Dr. Zubirán was the person who helped select young investigators from Latin America and Mexico to come to NIH for postdoctoral training. So it's a real honor to be here with you. It's also an honor to be here on the 40th anniversary of my meeting with Dr. Guillermo Ruiz Palacios. We met over diarrheal diseases, a terrible subject to be together on. He was working on Campylobacter, I was working on rotavirus, and here's a publication that really documented the protection against rotavirus from early infantile infections. Very seminal observation that we've also been able to make for COVID. So it really links our early research to the COVID problem of today. I want to discuss with you the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on society, on the scientific enterprise that we're all engaged with, on how our lives have been changed, and what the future holds for biomedical research. This is really the first major pandemic in 100 years. And what's interesting is that 100 years ago, the tools that we had to prevent spread of the Spanish flu, as with COVID, were exactly the same. We had masking, we had social distancing, we had hand washing, simple procedures, no medicines and no vaccines. That was a memorable event, and we really haven't had such an event until now. And this is an event that will be with us in our history for years to come. The first cases occurred in Wuhan in November, and it spread from Wuhan in this hospital where cases were identified without knowing what was the natural origin of the infection, whether it was a laboratory accident, whether it was an infection in the wild, or whether it might be a man-made variant. But that infection spread around the world in literally months, causing a huge, over 250 million cases, over 5 million deaths from COVID diagnosed, and over 12 million excess deaths. It's been a huge problem worldwide and demonstrates that a single infection in China can have ripples around the world. Pandemic preparedness will be important for our future. Mexico was not spared. You've had over 3 million cases, lots of deaths, and you're responding with vaccines. So it's wonderful to see that. And the pandemic has affected every part of your society. Here you see the 3 waves. It's affected masking, school closures and activities, businesses, gatherings, domestic and international movements, and you can see the severity of the peaks. So we've all been affected. In the United States, this flu has affected, or COVID has affected more people and more deaths than the Spanish flu of 1918. We estimate that 1 in 500 people have died already, and it's not over. And our hospitals with each peak have been struggling with admissions, with lack of supplies, ventilators, and oxygen to take care of people. So it's really been a challenge for society. I want to begin just by discussing the ways pandemic has affected our lives, and it's really in big ways. It's shut down our travel, businesses and unemployments, supply chain stockouts, No restaurants, no movies, no entertainment. Schools have been closed. Stress in society, delay in treatment of other diseases, which has been very important, and immunizations, unemployment, and social and political chaos that's been all over the news. And the costs have been enormous. One estimate of the cost from Larry Summers and David Cutler suggests that the pandemic in the United States has reaped more than $13 trillion in problems. Half of that was due to the loss of our gross national product, domestic product. The other half due to respiratory syndromes, illnesses, and the like. So they conclude that this pandemic is the greatest threat to our prosperity and well-being that we've encountered since the Great Depression. The response to science has really been extraordinary. We almost call it opportunities from disaster because we've seen the rapid mobilization of funds, the rapid development of vaccines and diagnostics, sharing of sequences, and more, global clinical trials, new regulations for FDA approvals, not regular approvals, but emergency use authorizations. So these are some of the questions that I want to run through in the next few slides. The first at NIH was that this Operation Warp Speed of the government gave funding over $4 billion now to develop vaccines that would be safe and effective for Americans within 1 year. A real challenge since we've never developed vaccines before. It also led to an activity we call ACTIVE, accelerating COVID therapeutic interventions and vaccines, with the idea of developing drugs, monoclonal antibodies, streamlining clinical trials, and getting regulatory processes in line. And finally, over $600 million to develop a variety of rapid diagnostics. Warp Speed itself provided by the government $18 billion for vaccines alone. And that money went out to advance market commitments to about 7 companies, vaccine manufacturers, to deliver new vaccines for a disease they had never made vaccines for. We went to multiple suppliers, so at least some of them would be successful. The decision was that US population would receive these vaccines first, and then we would provide vaccines to the global market. Warp Speed. And the Lancet demonstrated, and the Chinese revealed in January, the sequence of the virus, of the COVID-19 strain. And that revealing of the sequence early in January was the blueprint that most of these vaccines have been made from. It was within a week that candidate vaccines with mRNA technology were first developed. Now, the strains went around the world, and with sequencing, but immediately we could trace the spread of the disease by their sequence. And it was this use of sequence for the first time by many countries that allowed us to track the spread of the virus and see what could be done to stop it. It was interesting that at the beginning of the outbreak, only 3 sites in Africa could sequence strains. And it was in places like Rwanda that the fact that these strains sequence came from Europe led them to close down flights and block air travel for anyone except Rwandans coming back home. But you can see the variability of strains and the fact that most countries, many countries now have sequence data available. That advance was made possible by the simplification of sequencing. This little nanopore sequencer attached to a computer and could sequence strains in a half a day. It's been quite remarkable. And the aluminum the same. The cost was inexpensive. It could be done in field laboratories around the world and really was able to provide this data. It documented the importance of sequencing as this outbreak went ahead. And those strains were filed on several websites, such as GSAID and NextStrain and NLM. So here we were, and to date, there have been more than 3 million strains sequenced, 1 million of those in the United States. Well, at Fogharty, we started training for sequencing because many countries, as I said, in Africa and Latin America did not have this capability. And we partnered with the African CDC, with many other agencies to do this. What's been interesting is that in the absence of travel, how do we train internationally? And so we ended up with total virtual training, long sessions, very specific, so that we could do this training around the world. Here you see Nydia Travao from Fogharty and James Otieno at Fogharty working together with folks at Johns Hopkins University on courses that were provided and are available now in packages. A different way of training and doing business. We also, Nydia also worked in Mexico with the Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán. And you can see here sequences over time and that great big peak of Delta virus earlier this year. So even in Mexico, we could look at the dynamics of the SARS spread, evolutionary history, and the spread of strains and transmission dynamics. Well, we also got involved heavily with modeling. And Dr. Cecile Vibo at Fogharty helped us think about modeling. Here's an example of modeling that was used by the United Kingdom to project what they would be doing for lockdowns. You can see the red curve shows what the pandemic was predicted to do from March if the UK did nothing. If they isolated cases, you see the blue line that shows the terrific impact that case isolation and quarantine, household lockdown, social distancing would make, and subsequently school and university closures. So if the interventions worked, it would really stop that early peak, and that it did. So it was quite effective in some settings. Also, the lockdown changed the R sub naught of infection. R sub naught is the number of subsequent infections that would occur from one case. And here you see that with each different intervention, A was self-isolation, B, social distancing, C, school closure, and D, public events, you can have complete lockdown. Later stages of the pandemic are envisioned here. And what Cecile did was to bring together a group of modelers in the United States, 10 modeling teams, each with different assumptions on their models. And you can see how by pulling together a cluster of modelers, we could actually track the pandemic more accurately and make these predictions. These predictions were used, and this group of predictions were used by CDC to maintain the mandates for non-pharmaceutical inventions and different scenarios that would be playing out in the spring of this past year. So very helpful for public health. They could also look at the impact of the vaccination campaigns in different states. You know, in the United States, some states really resisted immunization and others were quick to embrace them. You can see that on the graph of the United States, the map, where the dark curves are the ones that resisted immunizations, the lightest curves accepted. And on the graph on the left, you can see how the projections of cases per 10,000 was related to vaccine coverage below. Also, when we're now predicting that we're going to have immunization of children, and these are the projections for vaccinations in children from 5 to 11 years old, which is being discussed or just discussed by our advisory committee on immunization practices. Really, the use of modeling to predict outcome, demonstrating the impact of modeling overall. So there's been a huge appetite for modeling, which has gotten great media interest. It's been used around the world in Europe and the United States, and it really has been impactful for all. Diagnostic development was a real problem in the United States, and it was at NIH that we had a program, $600 million, to develop new tests. We've produced over 500 million tests to date, 27 that were FDA approved, and lots for over the counter. The way we did this was not the normal way that NIH does business. Normally, we have investigator-initiated research. But in this case, we set up an ARPA-like selection process. We called for applications for innovative technologies and tests, and we got 716 to do this. These were down selected through a Shark Tank-like process to 140. Some were asked for further discussions and review. 35 went into phase 2 trials, and about 27 have been taken into market. And here are just a few of those new diagnostics. It's been quite remarkable. And you can see there are diagnostics for home care, laboratory use, and different lab products, but they're all available now in the US. Also, there was the unusual for medical research. You know, as researchers, we usually go out and investigate, publish our work in peer-reviewed journals. And sometimes that peer review can take months to come to the public view. In this pandemic, because the data was so essential, it was set up the rapid data distribution on formats like bioRxiv. And here you see that early data could be put immediately in manuscripts, immediately in the public domain. They could be peer reviewed by visitors to that domain and subsequently published in the peer review literature. There have now been over 300,000 publications on COVID to date, and these are all available on pubmed.gov. So we have both bioRxiv and then the final publications as they turned out in the final analysis. Some of these publications, by not being peer reviewed early on, fell by the wayside and were discarded. The other major factor that occurred with this pandemic, and which we're applauding, was that in the new administration, President Biden has chose to have Eric Lander not only be chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, but he's made him a member of the cabinet. First time we've ever had a scientist as a member of the cabinet. And Tony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, has become the chief spokesman and the chief medical advisor to the president, really our most outstanding physician in infectious diseases. So the elevation of science in the government, and we know that with this leadership, we're going to be much better off in science as we go forward. The other feature that's been wonderful is we've seen the globalization of clinical research. We've had programs and clinical trial networks around the world for HIV, for cancer, for other diseases. And those platforms, those sites for clinical trials have been embraced to test COVID therapeutics, monoclonal antibodies, antivirals, and dispelling false claims, like the claim that hydroxychloroquine from a French report did not provide any protection, or ivermectin, which has been suggested and is widely used. So these global trials have really accelerated the advance of new diagnostics and vaccines. Many of them have been done in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru. So Mexico is right in there in testing immune modulators for severe disease. Another feature, which is unique from this pandemic, was the fact that the time from getting the sequence in January to the time that the FDA first approved a COVID vaccine was about 9 months, 10 months. It was the shortest ever for a vaccine. The earliest before had been 4 years for the rubella vaccine, and our rotavirus vaccines took over 20 years. So this was really an incredible acceleration of results. How did that happen? It was really basic science, and I'll talk about that later. But the other feature was that this FDA provided what's called an emergency use authorization in December. So we had a vaccine in less than a year for public use. The difference between emergency use authorization and an FDA recommendation is that emergency recommendation usually requires 1 to 2 years of safety data on the vaccine, even though we know that most of the adverse events occur in the first 2 months or so. The emergency use authorization allowed for that 2-month window to then approve the vaccine for emergency use so it could go out and be used. And I think this idea and understanding of the emergency use authorization made many people fearful that we were rushing authorization of a new vaccine that hadn't been fully tested using the normal 2-year precaution. Well, let's think about the vaccine platforms and how we were able to achieve such an amazing success with this virus. First, as I said, the sequence of the virus was made available. And since we had previous experience with SARS and MERS, we knew a lot about coronaviruses and their antigens. But here are the 4 key platforms that have been used to make vaccines: the mRNA platform, replication defective live vector platforms, recombinant subunit protein platforms, and attenuated live vector platforms. The first 2, the mRNA and the replication defective platforms, had never been used before. So that when the government gave each of these companies an order for 100 million doses, there was no security whatsoever that they would be able to deliver on time and within a year. So it was a big risk, and it turned out to be a risk that paid off. But similarly, the other approaches are panning out as well. And so each of these companies was committed to 100 million doses for the US, with the hope that we would have enough for the US population from the get-go. New technology and advanced market commitment for these vaccines. Well, WHO established a patent pool for vaccines and pharma because they felt that the tools to prevent, detect, and treat this pandemic should be public goods. And this has been controversial, and it's still in discussion. There are patents in the pool. Companies have been not so accepting of giving up their new technology for global use, but they are committed to partnering. So the pandemic has really opened the door to global partnerships. And you see here just WHO has hosted the COVAX facility to provide vaccines for the world on an equitable basis and to accumulate enough vaccines so that something like 20% of the world's population, the elderly, the healthcare workers, could get vaccine early on. It's been a challenge to get countries that make vaccines to give up supplies because scarcity does not accelerate equity. But I think vaccines aren't becoming available, and there will be surpluses of vaccines in many countries by the end of this year. So there are many controversies that have come on, and let's speak about those controversies. One, and I just mentioned, was equity. Who will get vaccines first? Can you have global equity with scarcity? Can the COVAX facility allow for the distribution of vaccines by country and by high-risk groups? And who are the high-risk groups? Healthcare workers, the elderly, immunocompromised, school teachers, grocery workers who we see every day. Lots of vaccine misinformation, something we never anticipated with the success we've had with these vaccines. Mandates. Can we mandate that everybody be vaccinated? This has been a huge issue in the United States around individual rights. People who do not want to accept a vaccine that has not been fully vetted by FDA with a final recommendation. They're skeptical of government. There are adverse events, albeit rare. So this misinformation has spread through the social media. And mandates have been difficult to accept, although now we have mandates for all federal workers, all companies that employ more than 100 people, and others to come. Vaccine passports is another issue, and we all have CDC cards, but not an official national passport. The economics, we're reassessing global supply chains, new virtual work environments, masking controversies. Can you imagine that masking can be controversial? Well, just to review some of these, to date, 80% of the now 6 billion vaccine doses that have been administered have gone to upper and middle income countries. Only about 4% to date have gone to Africa. So this is a real problem of equity. Should we be getting booster doses in the US when many others have not received the first dose? An ethical promise. Disinformation has been a difficult problem from the beginning. It's been outlined by the press club, PNAS, misinformation in the public space. We really have not worked out a clear way to address this in the social media or to have mandates respond to this. Face mask, a political issue in the United States. How can we be so passionate about a piece of cloth on our face? It's been difficult. Mandatory vaccination legislation. You can see here in yellow, mandatory vaccination is obligatory for certain adults. In red, a few countries have instigated obligatory for all adults, but others are only limited. Will we have this worldwide when vaccines are available? And this is for countries to decide. Pandemic preparedness. We've just had the Ebola outbreaks in Africa over the past 2 decades, 2 of them. We've had epidemics all the time. How can we prepare for this pandemic? This, to the United States, $16 trillion impact. The biosecurity issue for health is really more costly this year than biosecurity for our military defense. We have to think of biosecurity in the same light as defense. It's clearly of major importance. And it's taught us that pandemic preparedness is worth the investment. The Gates Foundation and others have looked at the indirect consequences of the pandemic. Here, 31 million children who have fallen into poverty as child vaccine rates have fallen. So poverty around the world. Workplace issues. I have been working from my home in Atlanta and have not been to NIH in a year and a half. My entire office is teleworking, and it's been something we did 1 day a week in the past. Now it's 7 days a week. That's been a complete change, and it's caused some difficulties for those who have children at home who are not in school, dependent care of their elderly. It's been a total change in the way we do business. Virtual meetings like this, you don't know how much I would have loved to be with you in person today in Mexico City, but we have a travel ban at CDC until the pandemic cools down. We don't know when we're going to return to the workplace, except for the clinical center and some of the laboratories. It will be slow. And there's also been an inborn bias against women and minorities that we've seen through this pandemic. And how do we deal with issues of equity? So we're just learning how we're going to deal with this in the future. So keep tuned to this space. Also, this has become a shared agenda for the G7. And at their recent meeting in England, in Carbis Bay, they outlined plans to build back better, to end this pandemic, but to prepare for the future with a number of bold goals and initiatives. One is to set up global surveillance so we can detect and identify and sequence outbreaks immediately when they occur. Second is to develop new vaccines within 100 days, another bold prediction that never would have been thought about 2 years ago. A third is to take the group of virus families, 20 or 25 virus families for which we've seen outbreaks, and plan an inventory of vaccines and drugs that could respond to these. So as with the COVID-19 SARS virus, the coronavirus, we knew from past pandemics about the structure of the spike protein. We knew about mRNA technology. So we should be able to respond more rapidly. We have new experience with viral vector technologies, expressed antigens, and the like. We also see that building back better, being able to stop pandemics can really reinvigorate our economies. And we've seen the economic impact of the pandemic in all countries of the world. We think this can help secure our future prosperity, protect our planet, and embrace our values. So it's a major stand by the G7 that hopefully will be enacted in the years ahead. COVID also will likely transform global production. Great shortages occurred in delivery of goods, not only for vaccines and key component of vaccines, but key components like chips for automobiles, where our automobile production in the United States is down because of a few essential chips. These problems will really call us and encourage us to bring some of those essential products to be built at home, reshoring, diversification, and regionalization. So we have global value chains in the coming years, not only for the United States, but for regions around the world. Medical teaching. My son is a fourth-year medical student. He spent his first year in medical school, second year in medical school, virtual teaching, sitting at home, looking at computers. And about 5 months of his clinical rotations were done in seeing patients with telemedicine. It's been a different experience, and it'll be something that he'll have to catch up with as he goes into clinical practice. But we've moved to virtual learning. We're trying to create opportunities and getting the jobs done. But maybe some of these training materials could be used to improve the quality of training around the world. And that's one of the hopes and aspirations from the pandemic. Building leadership, and I think this is from an article that my deputy Peter Kilmarks and I wrote about building global health research capacity. It's building leaders to help us into the future. And when we look at the trainees at the Fogharty Center, we see that leaders in Africa, John Nkangasong was a Fogharty trainee, Vanessa Rougier in Haiti, Jerome Singh, Zunyu Wu in China, leading the COVID pandemic in Beijing, and others. So I think that training in infectious diseases and HIV for most of these has been absolutely essential to provide leadership in countries to move from one virus to another. Leadership training. Another feature of this pandemic has been the move to digitization of our health infrastructure. We don't have good electronic medical records universally throughout the United States that link together. But for COVID, we really need that information. So this pandemic has encouraged the digitization of immunizations in a way that never would have happened before. And I actually have a digitized card that gives my immunization records that I can use for traveling or going to restaurants and the like. We have now an initiative that's being planned at NIH from the budget, this year's budget, next year's budget, for ARPA-H, Advanced Research Project Agencies for Health. This is built on the idea of the Defense Department's DARPA, which has been very creative in getting innovations into the market, taking basic science and moving it to products. And so it's hoped through this initiative that we will be able to take some of the lessons we've learned from our own research at NIH and turning it into products, drugs, vaccines, and devices. Well, let's think about Mexico. Fogharty hosts the World Report documentation. It's a database of grants from 11 funders around the world who provide research funding to countries wherever they may be. I looked at this site before giving this talk, worldreport.nih.gov. I put Mexico in for 2020, and I came up with 196 records, many of those from the Internacional de Ciencias Médicas y Nutrición Salud Zubirán, your institute in here, which has really the most, among the most grants from NIH alone. It's been remarkable to see, and it's an amazingly good reference point for you in Mexico. You can go down to the collaborators, the abstracts from this website. Take a look. Also, from this website, you can find things like this grant that went to Guillermo Ruiz Palacios, my colleague, at the time of the last pandemic of H1N1, where Guillermo helped establish a network for infectious disease surveillance and clinical research. NIH funded, but NIH can take our funds anywhere in the world where we can address a problem and get a solution. So this network now has been included to look for chikungunya virus, Zika, and now COVID-2. So challenges going forward: can we have a global pandemic surveillance system that identifies new outbreaks within a week or two? Can we prepare vaccines and distribute them within 100 days or less? Can we build regional centers to make vaccines, drugs, supplies, and devices? Can we refit the supply chain so that we have multiple providers of key ingredients and regional manufacture? Can we accelerate research on the 20 major virus groups to have prototype vaccines and drugs for each class? How can we assess collateral damage of not having prepared and the loss of economic value, school attendance, hospitalization? Can we grant biosecurity the same priority as we grant military security? Well, this week, as I was preparing for this, every day we have new announcements of discoveries in our newspapers, front page. New antiviral last week effective by Merck, effective in reducing mortality and severe disease by 50%. We also noted 140 children who had lost a caretaker to COVID, which has long-term consequences for their growing up and education. So for Mexico, let's think about your biomedical enterprise. You have a great tradition in research and medicine. You're a second or third most common recipient of NIH funds. You have a productive publication track record. Can you build on this tradition and do even better? Can you secure increased funding as we have been doing, because this pandemic has been so consequential to your economy? We've also seen biotechnology is one of the most rapidly growing sectors of our economy and the economies of many high-income countries. If we invest in biotechnology, if we invest in the knowledge formation, this can be a huge boon to the economy. We need to invest in the training of next generation researchers and leaders in biomedical sciences. And we have to really deal and address once and for all the issues of health equity that hold back progress on many fronts. And finally, we're not going to be safe from COVID until we're all safe. So that coronavirus will continue to circulate and evolve unless we capture it now. For funding, we at Fogharty host the website for all new grants from NIH. So if you're interested in funding news from all of NIH in the global sphere, it's on this website of Fogharty, and you can get this on a regular basis, on a weekly basis. I want to end by thanking Dr. Krstanovich for the invitation to speak with you. He has been so instrumental in thinking about diabetes and building relations with NIH. And I have to thank you for the honor of being here to speak to this crowd. Dr. Ruiz Palacios, my colleague for 40 years. Also in the audience, the dean of your medical school, UNAM, Dr. Enrique Graue, and the Minister of Health, the Secretary of Health in Mexico, Dr. Jorge Alcazar. Thank you all. This is a time for celebration, and I want to congratulate you on the 75th Aniversario del Instituto Nacional de Ciencias Médicas y Nutrición, Salvador Zubirán. Gracias por su atención.